2018 High Ridge Trail just north of Cedar Hollow. I went there because I needed to be alone, and because an old post on a hiking forum promised a ruined lookout with a view that swallowed the valley. I had driven 2 hours on a narrow county road, parked at a gravel turnout, and followed a faint trail that disappeared and reappeared between tangles of laurel and fallen trunks. I was curious and tired and looking for a silence that would let me think, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. I also knew the lookout was technically off limits because it was unstable, but the kind of stubborn curiosity that had sent me into woods alone for years won out. I carried a small backpack with 2 nights of gear, a compact stove, a GPS unit I had updated the night before, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a heavy-duty sleeping bag. The air smelled like wet pine and old smoke in places where past campers had left charcoal pits. The first sight of the ruin was sudden. An old timber platform and a narrow ladder leaning against a square room with shattered windows that reflected the lower-end sun like dead eyes. I had no idea that in a single night I would face 3 separate things that still do not make sense. I am Alex, and backstory matters because I did not stumble into danger by accident. I grew up outside a small town where you learn to read maps and rivers before you learn to drive. My father taught me to tie knots and to respect weather reports. By my mid-20s, I had slept in vans and under open sky enough to know what a real emergency sounded like. I chose solo trips partly because I liked the solitude, and partly because they felt like tests of attention and calm. A few years before this night, when I was 23, I had a close call on a night hike after following a miscalibrated GPS and twisting my ankle 2 miles from the road. That incident left me with a habit of double-checking equipment and leaving detailed plans with someone I trusted. My sister Lily usually knew my approximate route, and my friend Marcus sometimes checked my location if I asked. I had also learned to respect rangers, even when they were annoyed at trespassers, and I had no patience for people who treated forests like playgrounds without consequences. All of that history made me methodical about gear and hyper-aware of small anomalies. It also may have made me confident to a fault in situations where I should have been cautious. I set up near the platform as the sun sank. The smell of wood smoke rose from a long cold pit below where someone else had once camped. The ground under my pad felt springy from a recent rain. My flashlight had a faint metallic smell from the new batteries. I ran my hand along the ladder and felt splinters and old nail heads. I checked my GPS and confirmed the coordinates. I spoke out loud to break what felt like a hush. I said to the empty platform, "All right, 2 nights, check in with Lily in 12 hours. I said it more to anchor myself than to expect an answer. Then I boiled water, inhaled the bitter scent of instant coffee mixed with pine, and watched as orange and red smeared across the valley. The first odd thing was a set of footprints near the charred ring down by the trailhead. They were too small to be my size, and oddly spaced, like someone had been stepping lightly on purpose. I touched the soil and found it damp and cool, and the impressions recent. I could hear when the wind pushed the pines and when sap popped in trunks. The scene felt like a photograph that was missing its caption. Nothing overtly threatening yet, just misplacements. I remember 3 small clues before the night split open. First, the footprints I found at the camp pit. Second, a faint scent like a resinous oil that did not match the smoke scent and that lingered upwind as if someone had rubbed something along the bark. And third, a low humming sound I dismissed at first as insects, but that turned out to be something different when the dark thickened. Each of these was small enough that a sane person could ignore them, but together they made my skin tighten. I did a technical check of my gear and noted the GPS model and battery life, the flashlight lumens, and the stove fuel level so that later I would have proper details for any report. I took a quick photo of the footprint with my phone and texted it to Marcus with the message, "Seen this, not mine." Marcus replied almost immediately with a thumbs-up emoji and, "Be careful." That was the last text I sent before the first real event. When the moon vanished behind cloud, the valley was a black bowl. I settled near the platform and propped my flashlight within reach. The forest seemed to close, sound like a lid. The humming became clearer, a low, uneven thrum, like distant machinery, but too intermittent to be a generator. I could taste copper when I breathed in deep, and my throat felt suddenly dry. I saw an orange light move among trunks down by the old service road at the edge of the clearing. At first I thought it was a camp stove or a headlamp. The light bobbed and then paused as if someone was standing still. I waited. The light blinked 3 times slowly and then stilled. I could smell roasting wood and something sharp like kerosene. The flashlight at my side felt heavier. My hands trembled when I reached for it, the fabric of my glove rasping against skin, and the sound of my breath seemed too. For a minute I debated the rational options. Call Ranger Cole, wait until daylight, or go down and check. I slid the ladder up so it leaned at a safer angle and kept the platform between me and the light as a barrier. I told myself I would stay put, but curiosity unwound me. I climbed down to the lower trail, with my flashlight angled to cut through the underbrush. The flashlight beam made dust motes look like slow swimming fish. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of crushed leaf and something metallic. I found one more set of prints crossing the trail, leading away from the charred pit and into the thicker woods. They were small, maybe a woman or a slight man, and they stepped lightly like someone avoiding sound. They were not the prints I had seen earlier. I called out without expecting an answer. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice came back thin and swallowed by the trees. A voice replied from my left behind a stand of hemlocks. "You should not be here." The voice was close, older than I expected, and calm in a way that made the hairs on my forearms stand up. I turned the flashlight and saw a dark shape. The light caught a face for less than a second, and it was weathered with lines and a narrow hat pulled low. The person stepped forward and lifted a hand as if to show they meant no harm. There is an initial negotiation in encounters like that, where you have to gauge threat by tone and posture. I remember thinking the face did not match the voice that had said, "You should not be here." I asked, "Who are you?" And the person said, "I keep the trail. You are trespassing." The person introduced themselves as Jenna and claimed a family cabin up the ridge. I believed that at first because her hands looked chapped and there were bed scratches on her boots consistent with a long walk. We exchanged a few more lines. She asked my name. I told her. She warned me again about the lookout and about coyotes. She asked why I kept the ladder up, and I said I was trying to be careful. The small talk diversified into a softer exchange, where she offered advice about where to place a tent in case of rain. The light bobbed slightly in her hand and smelled faintly of oil. At the time, the interaction felt mundane and almost friendly enough to let down my guard. I did not know that this was the curtain rising on a more complicated night. Insert comments CTA here. If you were in my place, what would you have done when the light first showed up and someone said, "You should not be there"? If you think I should have stayed put, write one word in the comments, like cautious or terrified. If you think I should have walked away, write another word, like brave or reckless. I read every comment and I use them to decide whether to go back to the site or to reach out to people who know the area. Your reaction matters to me and also to others who might travel into similar quiet places. The first full confrontation came later as the dark reached a thickness that erased shapes at 10 paces. The humming grew into patterns, and the orange light returned, but this time it moved differently, more deliberate, like someone tracing a line among the trees. I stayed on the platform and listened. There was a slow creak that came from the ladder bolts when the wind shifted, a creak that matched a rhythm I had learned to notice. Then there was a soft knock on wood not 10 feet below, like a palm hitting a post. I felt my stomach drop. I answered, "Who is that?" And a whisper answered, "Not your problem." The voice was closer, and this time thinner, and edged with a breath that smelled of tobacco. I whispered back, "I am alone." Silence. Then the knock again, more distinct. I switched my flashlight to high and scanned the area. The beam picked out a pair of bare footprints leading to the ladder and then stopping. They were different from the earlier small prints. They seemed to have been pressed with toes slightly turned. I called up, "Show yourself," and someone answered from below, "We do not show what we are." The reply had a cadence like a chant and made my skin prickle. Dialogue sequence in the main encounter started, and I will not summarize it because the exchanges are necessary to understand the decisions I made. The exchanges were long and numerous, and each one changed how I moved. I said, "If you are dangerous, get away now." And the voice said, "We are not the dangerous ones." And then I asked, "Who are you then?" and was told, "Watchers." I answered with a laugh I tried to keep small, "Watchers of what?" And the answer came soft, "Of people who cross lines." I challenged them, "You cannot keep people away by hiding and whispering." And the voice said, "We are not hiding." I probed, "Why the light?" And the voice said, "To guide the lost." I said, "I am not lost." And the voice said, "You are, because you crossed the map." I asked, "Map of what?" And there was only a pause. I said, "I am leaving now." And someone hissed, "Do not leave." I asked urgently, "Why not?" And the voice replied, "It will follow." I said, "Follow what?" And the reply was a click of teeth, like a sound rather than a statement. I asked, "Is this a game?" And the voice said, "This is old," and pressed with, "This is ours." I asked, "Whose ours?" And the answer drew a breath that smelled of wet earth. The place. A string of back and forth was 10 exchanges, and each one tightened my fear. The sensory load in that moment was intense. The flashlight beam turned damp with motes of pollen and ash. The orange light down in the trees left a halo of heat on the bark that smelled faintly of grease. My boots creaked on the platform boards, and each creak sounded louder than it should have. The foliage around the platform whispered, as if holding its breath. There was a feeling in my mouth like grit, as if something airborne had soaked teeth. My shoulders tensed, and I tasted iron. The third sense was a physical pressure at the base of my skull, as if someone had put a hand there. My skin felt textured and frayed, as if rubbed with coarse burlap. My hearing narrowed to the rhythm of the knocks and the cadence of that voice. The light smelled like old lantern oil, and my throat closed when a second whisper came from the dark that said my name. After that exchange, the situation escalated in ways I had not expected. The ladder rung clattered when something heavy shifted near its base. A shadow moved across the inside of the platform where my cooking gear sat. My phone vibrated with a text from Marcus asking if I had sent a picture. I did not answer. In the hush, I heard a scrape not far away, like fabric against bark. I said, "If you come closer, I will call the ranger." And the voice said, "We hear the calls. They come, they take, and then they leave." I demanded, "Who takes?" And the reply was, "They take what moves, and we keep what does not." I remember thinking in a terrible flash that the voice meant people who walked away at night and left things behind. The orange light bobbed to the left and then vanished altogether, as if someone had put a hand over it. The silence that followed felt thicker than the dark. I thought about leaving then and weighed the options. My GPS had a signal, but it was weak. My phone showed 1 bar. I worried about getting to the road in that signal-poor valley if something moved to block my return. The first major moment of tension that required slow pacing was when I decided to descend and confront the shape behind the ladder. I moved deliberately, counting breaths and keeping my flashlight low. The wood underfoot was slick with dew, and my fingers left wet impressions on the ladder. Halfway down, I felt a tug at the back of my jacket, as if someone had grabbed cloth to slow me. I froze, back pressed to the ladder, and whispered, "Stop." And a voice right below me answered, "We do not wish you harm if you listen." I asked, "Listen to what?" And it said, "The rules." I demanded, "What rules?" and there was only static and a movement. That segment of time stretched out to long paragraphs of small noises, each one a marker of time: the rustle of leaves, a small stone rolling, a distant animal call that sounded too close. This tense moment lasted long enough to feel like an age, about 5 minutes on my watch that felt like an hour. My pulse pounded. I took a slow step, and the tug came again, stronger. I pulled back up and slammed my hand against the platform board and shouted, "Enough!" The shout echoed, and the weight on my jacket vanished. I knew then that staying would be a risk, because the voices seemed attached to patterns in the dark and to unspoken rules. I also felt on some level that the place had a will. I set up a plan. First, I would gather essential gear quick. Second, I would secure the ladder and my rope in a way that would let me descend with one hand free. Third, I would start back to the car and follow the GPS track which I had saved. The technical process I used to prepare to move included securing my backpack straps across my chest and tightening my boots so they would not slip. I tested the flashlight lumen and set it to strobe if needed. I set my GPS to track mode and left a breadcrumb track so it would log the path. I recorded a short voice memo stating my actions and tagged it with coordinates to send to Lily when I had signal. These procedures were deliberate and practiced from earlier hikes and may have been the reason I made it out. The step-by-step quick checklist took about 2 minutes but required steady hands and breathing. The second main scene was the actual attempt to leave, and it contained more dialogue exchange and a faster tempo because everything happened in compressed time. I climbed down with my pack and felt the dirt under my boots loosen. At the first bend in the trail, a man blocked it. He had a thin frame and a cap that shadowed his face. He said, "You cannot go that way." I said, "I will pass," and he stepped aside like a hinge and then closed again. I asked, "Who are you?" And he replied, "We are the ones who mend lines." I said, "Which lines?" And he answered, "You will see when you try to take them." And he tapped the air with a finger. I told him, "I have a right to be on a public road." And he said, "Roads change here." I asked, "What do you want from me?" And he said, "Only that you do not carry what you are not meant to." I said, "What am I carrying that I should not?" And he reached into his coat and pulled out an object wrapped in cloth and showed me a faded photo of the lookout in daytime. "It remembers." And when I asked, "Remembers what?" he tilted his head and the wind answered for him. That conversation had a dozen shifts, and each reply made me more unsure of the ground under my feet. The sensory map in this second confrontation was different. The man smelled of damp wool and earth. The cloth photo had the powdery scent of old paper. The flashlight threw hard edges on his face, revealing a smear of dirt on his cheek. His voice had a reedy resonance that sounded like wind through reeds. The trail underfoot crunched with old pine cones, and the air had a metallic tang, like there had been a small copper deposit nearby. I felt cold sweat running down my spine and an itch behind my left ear. I could see steam rising from my breath in the cooler night air. There was a taste of ash from the distant embers of the old campfire. All of these small sensory notes made the dialogue feel more urgent. The escape proper began when the man made a small motion like he was about to step in front of me. I pushed past and ran. That moment was a high adrenaline sequence with rapid sensory and procedural detail. My feet hit loose rocks and slid. I threw my pack up and felt the canvas scrape my shoulder. Branches slapped my face and hands and left wet streaks. I heard something stumble nearby and a low murmur follow my steps. I glanced back and for a second caught a shape at the edge of the light with a profile like a child and a hat. I heard a single voice call my name, and it was the deep calm of Ridge Sheriff Ramirez, who had come because a passing motorist had called in seeing a headlight and a figure near the turn. I skidded to a halt, and the aura of the woods shifted a degree because I was no longer alone with the watchers. I told Officer Ramirez everything in a rush. Someone was here. They spoke to me. They said not to go. They said, we keep what does not move. And Ramirez listened and muttered, we will check. I asked, will you stay? And he replied, we will file a report and coordinate a search in the morning. That exchange calmed me enough to breathe, but did not solve the mystery. There are technical notes here worth recording because I followed an informal protocol. When I reached the road, I flagged down a car and asked them to call the sheriff. I described the location using GPS coordinates and the sheriff unit number. I filed an initial verbal report and then a written statement at the station that included my photo of the footprints and the timestamps from my GPS log. The chain of custody for the photo and the GPS data was informal at first, but then documented by Officer Ramirez, who wrote down the file number and took the phone as evidence for the log. The way the police logged the information and the way the GPS track was exported was crucial for any follow-up. These procedural details are dry, but they mattered the next day when a search found traces that matched my notes. The third and final encounter that night happened after I had calmed and stayed with Officer Ramirez at his patrol car for a while. He left to radio in and then returned with Ranger Cole, who insisted on walking the site with me in daylight. When the three of us walked back, the area that had been a ring of campfire and the thin trail was wiped almost blank, as if something had smoothed the ground. There were faint impressions like fingertips in the soft earth near the ladder, and a small tuft of fabric caught on a branch that matched the color of the cloth in the photo the man had shown me. As the sun rose, a pale orange spilled through the pines, and the place shed some of its menace. We spoke as a group with more concrete words and questions. I asked, "Have you seen anything like this before?" And Ranger Cole said, "Not like this, but there are stories." And Officer Ramirez added, "We have had missing persons reports over the years linked to old sites like this." I asked, "Do you think those people went missing here?" And Cole said, "We cannot say for sure, but the pattern is troubling." That morning exchange had fewer cryptic lines and more technical observations, and it felt like a relief to replace chance with facts. After the initial events, I had 3 distinct moments of tension that I still replay often. The first was when I decided to descend despite the unknown voice and the tug on my jacket. That whole episode expanded into a slow sequence of sensory details and choices that filled a few minutes of real time but felt like an era. The second moment was when I pushed past the blocker and ran, and heard the woods respond behind me in a chorus of low sounds that seemed to track my steps. The third was registering in daylight that physical traces had been altered in a way that suggested not casual visitors, but people who took pains to rearrange perceptions. Each of those moments deserves the slower narrative treatment because they were milestones in my fear and decision-making. The tension, measured in bodily sensations and the sound of breath and creaks, lasted long enough for those details to anchor into memory. The immediate resolution involved local authorities and a small informal search. Officer Ramirez called in a ranger team, and within hours we had a pair of volunteers, including Ben and Tom from a search and rescue group, tramping the paths. Ranger Cole logged the coordinates and planned a grid search for the next morning. I handed over my GPS track and the photo of the footprints. The search protocol included marking a perimeter, using grid sweeps, and checking any abandoned structures within a 5-mile radius. They used radios set to a common channel and logged each sweep with timestamps. The volunteers used handheld GPS units and clipboards to record the search line and to mark points of interest. They set up a temporary command near my car so that anyone arriving would have a place to check in. I gave a formal statement at the sheriff's station, and they filed it under an incident number. The technical language of dispatch and logs made the situation feel official, but did not dispel the unsettled feeling. In the days that followed, different people reacted in different ways. My sister Lily was angry that I had gone into a place with warnings, and she insisted I stay with her until I felt safe. Marcus posted the photo anonymously on the forum, and it sparked other posts from a user named Marcus Hike, who remembered a strange light on a summer night years ago. Jenna, whom I had met initially as a person in the dark, sent a short text the next morning saying, "I am sorry if I frightened you," and then later deleted it. Ranger Cole called and asked for a full list of gear and my exact route. Officer Ramirez suggested I keep a low profile because people sometimes seek attention at sites like this. Ben from the volunteer group emailed me a map of the grid they had searched. Tom, who had been at the gas station when I called out for help, said he saw a van linger at the turnout with headlights dimmed. I named each of these people in reports and notes because their actions and recollections became part of the record of that night. 1 month later, I felt a mix of relief and vigilance. The sheriff's station told me they had no new reports of missing persons that matched the area, but they did find signs of recent campfires and several anomalies around the lookout structure. Ranger Cole had returned and taken wood samples and some small fibers. He said the fibers would go for forensic analysis, but warned it could take time. I did not sleep well and checked my messages more often. Marcus called and we compared notes about old forum posts. Lily insisted I not go back alone. I took her advice and joined a group hike a week later with Jenna and a few others who knew the ridge. The presence of other people changed everything. The place seemed more ordinary in daylight, with laughter and shared snacks and the clack of trekking poles. Yet at the edge of peripheral vision, I would still catch a darker shape and feel the echo of a whisper. I started to notice patterns in my own mind, like a reverb after a loud sound. I filed a formal report at the sheriff's station, and they logged Ranger Cole's evidence bag number and told me how a photo and GPS export would be attached. The physical marks, like the tuft of cloth and the prints, were logged and placed in evidence, but the fibers came back inconclusive. The first month was a maze of small bureaucratic steps and private unease. 3 months later, the tone had shifted. The fiber tests were inconclusive, and the sheriff's office had a stack of reports from other hikers noting lights and voices at odd hours. There was a subdued local conversation about avoiding the ridge at night. Marcus Hike tracked down a pamphlet from the 1950s that mentioned a lookout keeper who had lived there and then disappeared without a file being closed. Ranger Cole arranged a community meeting where people shared experiences, and the overall sense was of a place with layered histories. I found myself less reactive to sudden noises, but more likely to plan exit routes and to carry 2 flashlights and a handheld radio. I began to write a detailed account to submit to a regional outdoors newsletter because I wanted others to read the procedural part of my story and not just the eerie bits. I realized a private thing had become public and that others might alter their plans because of me. Jenna eventually called and left a voicemail saying simply, "Some things do not like to be watched," and that only raised more questions than it answered. The most important change at 3 months was that I started to reframe the experience not solely as a threat, but as something in need of documentation. 6 months later, there were small but meaningful shifts. The schooner of dogs at a weekend race ran past where I had parked, and the field that had seemed lonely now had more people recreating. Officer Ramirez told me the sheriff's office had received a half-dozen similar reports over the last year, and that they were trying to connect the dots. Ranger Cole had organized volunteers to put up a no trespassing sign and to repair a few unstable steps so that the area could be accessed safely in daylight for inspections. Marcus published a longer thread that compiled several accounts and drew attention from a local paper that ran a short piece called "Mysterious Lights at Cedar Ridge." I felt both vindicated and uneasy because publicity brought a new kind of attention to the place. I avoided going alone, but I went with a small team that included Ben and Tom and Jenna once, and we walked the perimeter during the day and recorded evidence. Jenna admitted to me then that she had been living in a cabin near the ridge for years, and that some nights she had heard the same humming, but refused to elaborate. We all agreed to leave the place alone at night. The final 6-month entry for me was not a solution, but a truce. I resumed sleeping normally, more nights than not, but I still flinched at knocks on old wood. Looking back, there are things I learned and questions I still have. I learned how important it is to record coordinates and to get a photo of any anomaly. I learned to trust people like Ranger Cole and Officer Ramirez because their methodical approach turned fear into evidence and action. I learned that curiosity can get you into trouble, but also can create records that help others. The evidence we collected never produced a clear explanation. Some fibers were unidentifiable, and some footprints matched no known size. The voters in the forums argued about whether this was a group staging phenomena or genuine unexplainable encounters. My own feelings hardened into a careful wariness and a respect for places that have history layered on top of each other. I still go into remote places, but I am less likely to go alone at night and more likely to leave real-time location with multiple contacts. If you take anything from this, it is to prepare and to make sure someone knows where you are. If this story left you unsettled and you have a thought about what I did right or wrong, leave one word below, like cautious or reckless. If you have a similar experience, write it in the comments, because I read every message and sometimes follow up to corroborate timelines. If you like detailed real accounts of outdoor encounters, subscribe, because I share maps, equipment lists, and official logs that can help you plan safer trips. The night at Cedar Ridge changed me in ways I did not expect. I still carry the photo of the small footprints in my phone and the memory of that slow chant of a voice that said, "We keep what does not move." I do not know if what I met that night was human or something layered over human skin. I know only that I left and that the place kept something of me. If you go there, go in daylight, take a friend, and tell someone where you are.